Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 5. Now, this is the 5th volume of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. Now, I've already reviewed the first 4 volumes of this series, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you can check out those reviews. Now, Alan Moore did not originally create this series or this character. Swamp Thing is a series from DC Comics, which was originally created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson, but Alan Moore took over the series in the mid-80s, and his run lasted from 1984 to 1987. And Moore really took Swamp Thing and made it his own, to a point where you could almost consider Alan Moore's Swamp Thing to be its own separate series. Like Alan Moore, he took the whole Swamp Thing storyline and made it much darker and much more grounded. In a way, he did for Swamp Thing what Frank Miller did for Batman around this time period. And speaking of Batman, I decided to do this review as part of my series of Batman reviews, which is something I do every year. I try to do it every January, but this year my Batman reviews are starting in February, and I think it was the same deal last year. The reason I'm reviewing this as part of my series of Batman reviews is because Batman actually shows up in some of the issues that are collected in this volume, and I think Batman plays a big enough role in this story that you could qualify this as a Batman story. Now, most of the issues collected in this volume are illustrated by Rick Veitch, who actually took over the series after Alan Moore's run was over and done with. Now, the plot of Book 5 is it picks up where the American Gothic storyline ended. Now, in the American Gothic story arc, it turns out that there was this darkness that existed before God created the universe, and this darkness has returned, and it threatened to destroy heaven and hell, and possibly the earth as well. So Swamp Thing, along with John Constantine and a few other supernatural superheroes, had to defend heaven from this dark god. But while Swamp Thing was in the astral plane defending reality as we know it, Abby, his lover, was arrested because at a certain point, obviously before he left Earth, she was photographed with Swamp Thing while she was half naked, and it was presumed that she had sex with this thing. Now, Abby is Swamp Thing's lover, which might seem weird given that Swamp Thing is a plant creature, but Swamp Thing does have the mind of a human, and their relationship was developed well enough throughout these comics where you could buy that these two eventually became lovers, even though one of them is clearly not human. But because Swamp Thing is not a human, and she was caught apparently having sex with it, she's arrested on the same charges that you would bring up on somebody who committed crimes of bestiality. So what happens in this volume is Abby is arrested but is freed on bail, but she does have to show up for a court hearing, and she's being harassed by the people in her town because they're treating her like she's some kind of a pedophile, like it's so freakish to them that she's in love with this monster. Abby can't take the harassment anymore, so she flees to Gotham City. These comics are set in the DC universe, and she ends up getting arrested in Gotham, and Swamp Thing returns to Earth and finds out what happened to Abby. And needless to say, Swamp Thing is not happy, so he ends up declaring war on Gotham City unless they set Abby free. So, eventually Batman intervenes, and even though he understands where Swamp Thing is coming from, he is sworn to protect the city no matter what, so he tries to stop Swamp Thing. Meanwhile, you also start following the Sunderland Corporation, who want revenge on Swamp Thing for something that he did earlier in the series, and they plan to destroy Swamp Thing with the help of Lex Luthor. Now, I loved the first 4 volumes of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, but I have to say that this is probably my favorite of the series. Like, there's some really interesting storytelling going on in this. And there's really no black and white in here, with the exception of the Sunderland Corporation. They're kind of portrayed as more like two-dimensional bad guys, but in this story you have Batman kind of acting as an antagonist. Now, you understand where Batman's coming from, but you also understand where Swamp Thing is coming from. Now, if you look at this as a Swamp Thing story, again, Batman is kind of the antagonist, but if you look at this as a Batman story, Swamp Thing is kind of the antagonist. And I like how in this you really have Batman starting to question his actions. Like, Batman, he's there to defend the law, but he starts to question, is the law always right? Now, granted, I know being a vigilante is technically illegal in real life. You do have to suspend disbelief to a certain extent when you're dealing with superhero stories, but it's a really interesting philosophical question. Is the law always right? And I think Alan Moore is playing around with some really interesting social commentary here, where he's kind of using Abby and Swamp Thing's relationship to make a statement about relationships that aren't traditionally accepted by society. Like, you can look at it as a metaphor for society not accepting interracial couples, even though at the point these comics were published, that was generally accepted at this point, but it wasn't for the longest time. You could also look at it as a metaphor for same-sex couples. But you also have a lot of people who are accepting of Swamp Thing, and they start to use Swamp Thing as sort of a representation of their ideals. Like, there are a lot of environmental themes that are brought up in the story. Swamp Thing, he can make plants grow everywhere, and he can make trees grow, and there are people who are rallying behind him for environmental reasons because they feel he can save our damaged environment. And Alan Moore brings back a character who was introduced in an earlier Swamp Thing story called the Nuke Face Papers. This guy worked for a company that was knowingly dumping nuclear waste, and that's what created the villain of that story. And in that story, the villain gave his wife cancer, so he feels that he is responsible. When he hears about what Swamp Thing is doing in Gotham City, he goes there because he feels like he's being punished for working for a corporation that was poisoning the earth. Alan Moore also brings back the character of Chester, who was introduced in a Swamp Thing story called Windfall. It really is a fascinating story, and there's some really interesting social commentary in here. And if you want an example of how you do mature storytelling in a superhero comic, this is it. Now, there are several issues collected in this volume that take place after the main story arc that kind of work as standalone stories. One of them is The Flowers of Romance. This is very much a down-to-earth horror story, and not a supernatural horror story. Swamp Thing doesn't even show up in this issue, which, if you've read the issues leading up to this, you'll understand why. This issue is actually about two characters who were characters from the older Swamp Thing comics before Alan Moore took over, named Liz and Dennis, who we thought were killed by the Sunderland Corporation. But it turns out that they've been in hiding all these years, and during that time, Dennis has been completely controlling and manipulating Liz to a point where she's afraid to even plug in an outlet because she might get electrocuted, or even take a bath because she's afraid she might drown. But she tries to reconnect with Abby, and Dennis, who has completely gone off the deep end, is going after her and Abby. This issue, which as I said, really does stand apart from the rest of the issues collected in here, is a really powerful story about domestic abuse. Obviously sort of an extreme example of domestic abuse, but according to Stephen Passett, Alan Moore actually based a lot of this off of something that happened to one of his aunts. And it was also really brave of Alan Moore to take the character of Dennis, who, from what I understand, was a character that you were supposed to root for in the older Swamp Thing comics, and was an ally to Swamp Thing and Abby. It was really brave of him to take that character and make him a villain. After that, you get an issue called Earth to Earth. Now, this one doesn't necessarily read as a standalone story, because you do have to read the other issues leading up to this in order to understand what's going on in this one. But there's this really moving section where Abby fantasizes of a world where her and Swamp Thing's relationship is accepted, and you see all the people who were cruel to her actually accept kept in her in Swamp Thing, and it's just such a sad and emotionally moving moment in the story. The final issue collected in Book 5 is called My Blue Heaven, and this one also reads as sort of a standalone story. This one also leads directly into Book 6 of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. The plot of this issue is following the end of the Batman story arc. Swamp Thing, in order to survive, has to leave the Earth, and he ends up recreating his body on an alien planet. And basically, in this issue, Swamp Thing literally plays God and creates a whole little world. Like, he creates a plant version of Abby, as well as plant versions of other people that he knew in the past. But these beings that he creates don't have a soul. They're only representations of his psyche. But I think it's really interesting that the little world that Swamp Thing creates mirrors the fantasy that Abby had in the previous issue. Now, Moore was writing these issues concurrently with Watchmen, and you can kinda tell because the whole deal with Swamp Thing leaving the Earth reminded me a lot of when Dr. Manhattan left the Earth for Mars in Watchmen. But yeah, I highly recommend this if you're a fan of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, but also if you're a Batman fan, but also if you like really good social commentary and really good character drama in comics, then I would definitely recommend this. So that was my review on Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 5, and bye.